well as higher wages for early childhood educators. And those wins happened because of the organizing and advocacy that we collectively did, that, you know, people testified, we emailed, we called our council members, and it was clear by the end that they couldn't ignore us, because on the day of the budget vote, one of the council members spoke in opposition to the tax that we were supporting and discouraged his colleagues from supporting it. But he said he knew that they were getting a lot of pressure to support it. And he was talking about us and our partners, and we were that pressure. So that was what's been happening in DC. In Maryland, we have also seen the power of having people organized for action. Throughout the Maryland General Assembly earlier this year, JUFJers and our partners showed up virtually. JUFJers submitted around 200 pieces of testimony and engaged with legislators on social media during hearings. And we know that legislators paid attention and followed up with those who emailed, called, or tweeted. And at the end of the session, historic bills around policing, immigrant rights, and housing all passed. So we are excited to build on those wins with you tonight as we think about our JUFJ campaigns across our jurisdictions and the Maryland legislative session in the coming year, and the people we need to keep winning. So with that, I also want to acknowledge that many of you are part of and belong to and are active leaders with JUFJ, and some of you are not. And so we welcome you to our community and to this conversation this evening. And if you have questions about anything that we're saying, please ask them in the chat and we will do our best to answer those. The next thing we are going to do is briefly talk about the agenda. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat. Please write your name, your pronouns if you'd like, where you live, and why you take action with JUFJ, and we'll come back to that question in a few minutes. Great. So this is what we'll be covering in the next 53 minutes. Our agenda is really packed, and so we're just diving right in. Normally, I think we would start out with a rounds question. We would start in breakout groups. We're just diving in tonight. So we're talking about power first. What is a base and why we build one, and how do we build a base? We'll reflect in small groups on that piece, on those pieces, and then we'll come back and talk about tips for turnout. And I'll pass things to Rachel for the power conversation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Can everyone hear me? Okay, I've been having sound issues all day, so if there are any issues, please let me know right away. I just want to name that we put the live transcription up on the, like you might see the transcription at the bottom of the screen. There is a way to turn it off, and I'm gonna just ask that one of the co-facilitators of the event can just like write instructions in the chat around how to turn off the transcription, the live transcription, if you don't want to see it. Okay, so why are we here? We're here because we know that it's all about power. And in order to make change, we need power. That none of what we want, none of what we do, all of our demands, the DC budget demands, none of that is winnable if we do not have power. So I want to take a second and brainstorm with you all. Write in the chat, if you can, what are some powerful organizations, either locally or nationally, but I think within our sphere that you know about. So what are some, when you think of a powerful organization locally in our sphere or nationally, write it in the chat. ACLU, Black Lives Matter, NRA, that's a good one, NRA. Okay, CASA, APAC, Amnesty. All right, keep them coming. Let me see. So some of these are new. I know some of these are probably going to be like DC and Montgomery County based, which I don't know as well. I'm not sure of all of these. SEIU, SEIU, Wendy, maybe, unless SEUI is something I don't know. Okay, so we got a couple of unions here. Developers, ooh, great. These are all great. Baltimore Police Union, absolutely, Tiffin, excellent. You guys, you're great. FOP, landlords. Think about organizations we know too. Like what are, organizations in our network that you think of as powerful? Chamber of Commerce, excellent. Okay, lots of unions, great. So when I think of some powerful organizations, and Sarah, if you can switch to the next slide, I think of, some of the organizations we listed here. These are organizations with bases, right? So like I'm thinking about the unions. I think someone wrote CASA. We know, oh, there we go. All right. So these are all examples of organizations with bases, right? So these are some organizations that came to mind on my end. Of course, JUFJ, but down here on the left, this is a union, Unite Here Local 7, that just won a campaign to unionize at the Hyatt shortly after this photo was taken at the march, and CASA. So these are organizations who mobilize large groups of people during critical moments to build public pressure on their issues by demonstrating their people power. So again, JFJ in Annapolis, and I already spoke about the examples. One aspect that makes an organization powerful is their ability to mobilize people, to turn out people at critical moments. And some of the organizations that you all listed, again, we got some unions, we had CASA, ACLU, are organizations that have people power and are able to turn out folks at critical moments. Next slide. So this is just thinking about power and its role in our movement one more time. I think this is a critical quote from Martin Luther King. I'll let you read it on your own, but it's one of my favorite quotes from King, and it really speaks. I think he says it best: "Love without power is anemic. We need power to implement justice." And this training is all about how we build power. So as the kind of organizing saying goes, power is either organized people or organized money. And you guys did a great example of listing some organizations that organize money, like the Chamber of Commerce, for example. So, groups that organize money, the state, big wealthy corporations, special interest group. But we as JFJ and our allies and partner organizations, we're never going to have enough money to fight against organized money with money. Like they're always going to out money us. So our role is really to organize people. And that's what we are here about. That's what we're here today to work on. So next slide. The three building blocks that we're going to, the three building blocks to organizing people, kind of like three key aspects to the work that we do: education and training. People need to know about our issues and why they matter. Organization and base building. People are in relationship with the organization. People are invested in JUFJ. They are interested in our organization and being in community with others in the organization. And mobilization. People take action at critical moments. People will come out and take action collectively together when the campaign comes to that critical moment. So these are kind of like key aspects or key building blocks that, outline the work that we do at JFJ as a base building organization. So I'm going to pass it over to Hannah, who's going to back us up a little bit and talk about what is a base.
Before we go there, I'm gonna kind of try to do some illustrating of what Rachel was just talking about with a bit of a case study, something that has happened in JUFJ before. So we can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, we don't have a slide for this one. I'm just going to talk. I'm going to set the stage. So I started at JUFJ in 2015 when we were in the middle of a rent control campaign. And we were moving forward. We were trying to push for two pieces of legislation to strengthen renters' rights to an affordable home and to preserve what affordable housing we had that was part of the rent control like block of homes in DC, which was rapidly disappearing. DC has a 2-year legislative cycle, and I started working halfway through, and we had 1 year to get these bills passed. So we had 1 year to build the power necessary to get them passed. I'm gonna drop that, and we'll come back to that story in a little while after Eliana's piece about what a base is and why we built one.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So now that we've talked a little bit about why organizing people is so important, it almost begs the question, right? Like, what is a base and why do we build one? So the definition of a base that we'll use tonight, or the definition of JUFJ's base, is the people who belong and feel connected to JUFJ and take action on our shared values. And if you scroll back up through the chat and look through some of the responses of why folks are here tonight or take action with JUFJ, right, you can see that thread. And why we build a base. Really fundamentally, we build a base to build power. And there's 2 subpoints there that we will dive into more throughout the night. One is to get bigger so we can be more powerful, right? The more people we have, the more capacity we have to be taking action and to be taking bigger action. And secondly, to build leaders and develop leadership. So before I hand it back to Sarah to continue a case study, we'll pause for a moment and just see if there are any questions. You can feel free to put those in the chat. And if you're still processing, no worries. We'll have lots of time for questions throughout the night.
Ileana, I sent you something privately, just a quick comment, because Rachel had mentioned something about how we can't out money the other groups, but we also can't out people them. We're just the Jews, and honestly, we're a very small percentage of the people. And I think that speaks to why we need to have coalitions and partners, because we as a group are not going to impress anybody with our numbers. At least my personal opinion. I could be wrong. I'm new to this. Thanks.
Amy, thank you, Amy. You're absolutely right. We are always part of a broader group, and we don't go it alone. You are absolutely right. Eliana, I didn't mean to cut you off if you wanted to respond directly to that.
Nope, that was great. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that explicitly into this space, Amy. So to move forward with our case study, I'm going to actually start at the end of our story. So about a year after I started, right before the end of the legislative session, JUFJ took the lead on putting together a rally to ask council members to, quote unquote, close the loopholes in rent control. It was Sukkot, which is a celebration, a harvest celebration. We built a sukkah in front of the DC City Hall building. We had speakers, our partner organizations, and dozens of people from JUFJ's base came out to demand that council members make the rent control laws stronger for tenants. You can see that picture of some of the folks who attended on the right side of this, or the left side of the screen, and on the right side was the chair of the Housing Committee, Councilmember Anita Bonds, still the chair of the Housing Committee, physically closing the loopholes. She and a couple other council members came out to do that in front of everybody. And then a couple months later, the council passed those bills. I don't want to say that they did it because of this rally, but this rally was a factor. It was part of showing them that there is a movement, that there was a lot of attention, that people really cared about their decision to move these bills forward, and that we weren't going to go away. We were there. So how did we do that? How did we bring all of these people to the DC Council that afternoon in October of 2016? JUFJ has a database of thousands of people, yes, and there are people who care about rent control or cared about rent control, yes. And there were people who were helping to plan it, yes. But what made them come out? What made them come out? And that's what we're going to be talking about next.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit now about how we build this space. And thinking a little bit back to that definition of base. A base is not this database that we have. We have this database, but it's the people that we're in relationship with that's going to take action with us. Those are the people who showed up. So I'm looking back through the chat as we started going, and I'm thinking about the way that people felt connected to the action that they took with JUFJ and why they're here. And for so many folks, there was Jewish values, meaningful action, and two words really stood out to me: community and connect. And I kept seeing people write community and connect so many times over. And one theme that I think that's really kind of connecting the way that we can think about building a base. We build a base through developing relationships, which mainly happen one-to-one. Someone probably invited you to a meeting one time, or you felt connected to someone. So can we put in the chat and have folks think about who are those people that you would want to ask for a one-to-one to build a relationship with? We'll give a few seconds for folks to respond. It could be, there's a question in the chat, like in your personal life. Yeah, it could be in your personal life or in a community that you're a part of. So I'm seeing an answer: people from your synagogue, from your religious community, from your neighborhood, people with similar values, voter squads, congregations, friends. A lot of community members, right? A lot of folks in your community, friends and coworkers who probably care, but maybe don't have the connection to take action. People with similar values. These are all great answers. People who want to take action with you, people who maybe also have their own networks. Thinking about people who maybe are connected to other folks who will be able to connect you to even more people. Yeah, these are great answers. And so then we're also thinking back to, like, where do we find these folks? We're thinking back to those three building blocks of education, training, base building, and mobilizing. And so if folks could also answer in the chat again, where do you find these people? Some people were also already saying Jewish communities. Where else would you look to have a one-to-one with someone? Social relationships, young professionals who maybe aren't plugged in, people maybe new to the area. Your phone directory, your phone, people who are in your, you scroll through, maybe you have them written down somewhere still, workplace. There's so many places. JFJ database, Facebook friends, participants in other activities that you do, volunteer groups. There are so many places. People have asked about DC issues and they just don't know about them. These are all really great answers. And we also really want to be doing one-to-ones with folks who are in these buckets that we were just talking about. So people who are attending our issue education programs or are coming to our meetings and events, people who we see taking action online, like someone said, maybe they're Facebook friends, maybe you're seeing like people posting about local issues, but they're not connected with JUFJ. And we saw a lot of responses here about people wanting to connect with folks in their synagogue relationships or their religious centers, wherever that is. And also, of course, the friends, the family, the people in our individual networks. And these are all the types of people that we want to be connecting with and building these personal relationships with. And we know that this doesn't happen overnight. I'm sure many, many people here have been to a one-to-one that took a really long time to schedule. No one's schedule matches up perfectly. And so it can take weeks. And then you only have a single one-to-one after weeks and weeks of scheduling, but then you do it again and again, and then you've trained some more folks on how to do a one-to-one, and then they're having one-to-ones, and all of a sudden you have a team of folks who are one-to-one people in their synagogues and their neighborhood groups and their tennis groups and their workplaces, wherever, and now you've had close to 50 one-to-ones. And from those connections, a couple of those people are going to tell their friends. And then soon enough, you've had an event that everyone has invited one more new person to. And so we're not going to talk about how to do the one-to-ones. We're going to be having a training on September 13th, and you'll have time to sign up later for that. But the one-to-one is really, in that personal relationship, is one of the core ways that we are building the relationships and working together. So I'm going to turn it back to Sarah to continue her story. And I'm loving some of these responses also. I'm noticing in the chat, people with birthdays that you celebrate, rabbis and teachers. There's so many folks to be reaching out to.
Thanks, Hannah. So my story, the beginning of my story is that I started at JUFJ, and I didn't have a base. I hadn't had a program yet. I hadn't met anybody yet. So I started at square one, which was emailing our entire base, asking people to meet with me. That was how I started. And I introduced myself, asked people if they wanted to get involved. So I got a few one-to-ones that way. We had a few people who had previously expressed interest in affordable housing and rent control specifically, so reached out to them individually. Pretty soon I was having 5 to 10 one-to-ones per week. And that's me as a full-time organizer. So obviously we don't expect you all to be doing that, but wanted to bring in how we are, as organizers, we're responsible for some of this, and then also want you all to, we want to be building this together. So that's how I started our rent control campaign. And through those relationships that were primarily developed through those one-to-ones were how we created a rent control core team and developed our leaders, and why people came to programs and took action, why people ended up deciding to host a house meeting about rent control. And ultimately, as I talked about the rally, why a dozen people from the JUFJ, or dozens of people rather, came to the rally from the JUFJ base. So I just want to layer on. So we're talking a lot about one-to-ones and making individual connections, but want to go back to the issue, education, and training piece, that those making connections one-to-one plus the issue, education, and training, plus all of the other things that we're doing. It's not a linear, we don't think about those things. First, we have to do the one-to-ones, and then we think about issue education. Those things happen kind of simultaneously as well as concurrently. I think about it as a spiral, if that is useful visual for you. But yeah, just wanted to offer that. Eliana, we're gonna move to some reflecting.
Yeah, so we know that we spent a half hour throwing a lot of different content pieces at you. So we wanted to take a moment and give everyone some time to be reflecting in small groups. So in a moment, we're going to open up breakout rooms, and there'll be about 3 to 4 people per group. And you'll have 5 minutes to be reflecting together on what, if any of this, is new or different for you, and how do you plan on using this information. And after you have 5 minutes in your group, we're going to come all back together and share out some of the things that we've been discussing. And this question will be in the chat, and the breakout rooms should be opening momentarily.
Wonderful. It is almost 8:30, so we'll come back together at 8:35. Our groups are about 3 to 4 people each, as was named. We'll see each other in 5 minutes. Please feel free to write in the chat if you have any questions. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had really thoughtful reflections. I'm going to pass it back to Eliana to lead us in a short group share back.
Yeah, thanks so much, Deborah. I know for me, it felt like those 5 minutes really flew by. And before we turn back to content, I would love for 1 or 2 people to unmute themselves and just share one thing that you talked about or one reflection from your breakout room. And if folks don't want to go off mute, you can also put things in the chat.
Whoops.
I wasn't cutting anyone off, was I? Yeah, so one thing we talked about in my group with Louise is trying to reach out to different demographics. For example, she used PG. It might not have as many synagogues or things like that where or people might normally go to. So I told her, you know, partner with different organizations who are present. I know one thing in our coalition, language access is really big. So we've made sure we partnered with different language groups and different speakers, so we can make sure that the language access is met, especially with our Latino and Spanish speaking communities.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really, really great reflection. And I think, Michaela, you
Oh, yeah, I guess mine's real quick. I think what I appreciate was that like the folks in my group, we kind of shared that like it's not easy, especially it's not easy to can feel like anxious, or it's hard sometimes to like connect with new people or to start those conversations. And it, you know, I think it's helpful to like be in those spaces and be like, this doesn't have to feel easy, or like other people aren't like as comfortable jumping in right away, but we also know that with practice it gets better. But I think it's helpful to acknowledge that shared experience for someone who's not like extrovert all the time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michaela. I think that is actually a really beautiful segue to some of the tips that Deborah is going to be sharing. So I'll turn it over to her, and thank you all again for such beautiful reflections in your group.
So as we've shared, right, just because we have folks in our base doesn't necessarily mean that they'll turn out to our fantastic action or event. So we do need to figure out what exactly we need to do to ensure we can bring folks to the things that we need to do to build power. So the first tip is to make a clear turnout plan with your team and share those responsibilities, right? It's a team sport. So we need to make sure that we have an accessible shared list of all the folks that we want to reach out to, that we're updating it regularly, and that when we assign outreach, we get specific. We literally go name by name and decide who is reaching out to each person. And of course, we'll need to make a clear plan and steps. And when we get to that plan, we can head to our next tip to include emails, texts, and calls to all of these folks as part of our turnout plan. So we can go to the second tip. So our second tip is when we're doing that outreach, once we have our list of our specific names, we want to make sure that our texts and calls and emails are tapping into relationships and the self-interest of others. If we make an ask en masse, the response that we get is going to be very tepid. But if we could make it in a way that clearly shows the folks that we're reaching out to understand their self-interest and how our self-interest is connected with the ask that we're making of them, we're much more likely to be successful in our outreach. So a really silly and fun acronym that I learned when I first started organizing to remember this is called CCCFU: connect, identify the relationship; context, identify the self-interest; commit, you make that hard ask, you say, are you coming to the event? And then the FU is to follow up, to make sure that you follow up with the person after they've said yes, like many of you were followed up with to join this event, to say, hey, saw you're signing up. Are you going to come? What questions do you have? And ensure that they make it all the way through to attending the event. We're happy to share some example texts and resources as a follow-up to this conversation, but I'm going to pass it to Rachel for our third tip.
Thanks, Deborah. So similar to kind of sort of what was already mentioned, but like, you ever have an event and you know, you invite your friends on Facebook and you say like, well, I posted it on Facebook and I got 100 views, so you know, I'm expecting 100 people there. And then like the event comes around and you didn't quite get the turnout you want. We know that indirect asks like sharing on Facebook are the least effective way to turn people out to an event. E-blasts, social media events and postings, newsletter articles, etc., are really good and important to get the word out broadly. And we should always use those as part of a communication strategy. And they are ineffective on their own. The best way to always ensure turnout for an event is that face-to-face personal ask. So there's different ways of getting people out to an event. And I would say there's sort of like a Maslow's hierarchy or some sort of like kind of like hierarchy of what we know is most effective. So face-to-face, even on Zoom, like a one-to-one meeting over Zoom is always going to be the most effective way of getting folks to an event, followed by a phone call and personal text. And then when we get to the sort of more like mass outreach strategies, such as a mass text, a mass email, a targeted email, we know those are least effective. So always the face-to-face personal ask is going to be the most effective way to turn someone out to an event. And Hannah's going to take on the next step.
Yeah. And the next one is accountability, which can sometimes sound like a scary word, in that we want to hold each other accountable for the folks that we decided that we were going to reach out to. And so this first step towards accountability is having these clear assignments. But once you have that, we have to hold each other and hold ourselves to following up and doing that outreach. So within your team, it really is about regular check-ins and reminding people of your goals. And accountability doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be about shaming or become a time where everyone lists all of their excuses about why they didn't do what they said they would do. We all have lives and things happen. And it should be about reaffirming to each other the commitments that you've made and the reason that you're doing this action. And I saw that there's a question, there's going to be a one-to-one training coming up that's going to go deeper into all of those things. But in this accountability, we want to be making sure that we are hitting the goals that we've made for ourselves while we do this turnout and base building. And I'm going to turn it back to Devorah.
Thanks, Hannah. So as we're holding each other accountable and making the asks, we have to also figure out how many people we need to respond to. And our last tip here is to use what we call organizer math to avoid overestimating our RSVPs. So generally, organizer math follows the principle that we'll actually reach half the folks that we try to contact. Half of those folks will say yes, and half of those who say yes will actually show up. So that said, the more effective our asks, the more we're identifying interest, telling stories, using targeted asks, the more likely we will better that ratio and make it more like, 2/3 of the folks that we ask will say yes. But with that said, let's say, for example, we want to get 20 people to come to an action or a program. What kind of outreach are we going to need to do? Well, we can go to the next slide. We'll take a few minutes to walk through that math. So there's a lot of numbers here, but it's really quite intuitive. So if we want to get 20 people to an action or a program, we want 40 RSVPs. And if we want to get 40 RSVPs, we'll need to call or send individualized emails to 160 active people that we have a relationship with or who are invested in the campaign. So again, based on that math, maybe we'll get a hold of 80, maybe half of them will say yes. In addition, we'll text 320 folks. It is a little bit more effective, but there's also a chance that we are not reaching people that we have a relationship with there. We're also going to want to send a mass email to hundreds. I know a lot of folks here get our JOFJ newsletters, so that's probably familiar to you. And then lastly, we're going to want to make sure we reconfirm those yes responses that we've gotten in order to increase the turnout from those who said they would attend. Again, that's the follow-up part of our CCCFU acronym. That follow-up is so critical. So I know we shared a lot of numbers and a lot of terms that might be new. We're going to take a few moments to pause and invite any questions that folks have. So as with our previous question opportunities, please feel free to share your questions in the chat and we're happy to answer.
Sorry, I meant to unmute myself. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I've heard the word teams come up a fair amount, and I was wondering how we would be dividing into teams and when.
That's a great question, Catherine. I'm happy to take a general attempt at this. And if any other co-facilitators want to add more specifics, please feel free. So when we're saying teams, what we're using that shorthand term to mean is essentially the collective group that is organizing an action or an event, or the team that's working on a campaign. So for example, in Montgomery County, we have a racial equity and policing team. And that team has a few different subgroups that each work on various events. So the team could be anything from that whole collective of leaders working on the campaign to maybe the 2 to 3 people working on an event. And certainly for each jurisdiction, that division of all the folks, right, in your campaign or on your team is going to look a little different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So with that, I'd love to invite any other co-facilitators to share more details for your jurisdictions.
Yeah, Catherine, I think what we're talking about is when I'm thinking about it for DC, I'm thinking about it in terms of our working groups and even each individual working group creating a base. So there are folks who are part of the working group who have their own relationships with people who they're trying to get to our events and to take action in the future, or that the groups have a spreadsheet of all of the people who have come to programming related to the work that you and your working group are doing, and that's the group that you're going back to and you're trying to build and you're trying to get bigger, and that we're working along with the JUFJ database, but to build a particular base for the issue or for the campaign that you're working on, that you're focused on with other folks at JUFJ.
Thanks for asking, Catherine.
Thanks for the question.
I would love to uplift a question that we got right after the second tip about the connect, context, commit follow-up, if that's all right, and just give that another quick review. And so as Eliana shared in the chat, that connect piece is really identifying like how we know somebody. So let's say, for example, I'm writing a text to Rachel to invite her to an action. And I know Rachel because we both walk our dogs in the dog park. Thanks, Laura, for bringing up this example. I would use that connection, right? The C in my acronym would be identifying that this is how I know Rachel and that she's not a stranger. The context part would be identifying the importance of the ask that we're trying to make. It's really setting the stage for why we're requiring building power and building a base to make something successful. So you can see here that the context is that in the state of Maryland, right, we know that there is an upcoming eviction crisis, and right now we have an opportunity to pause evictions, but we need to pressure them to keep people housed. So that's the context. It's essentially setting the stage for the ask that's going to come. So far we've gotten the connect, which is identifying how we know each other, the context, which is also the self-interest and that stage. The commit is going to be the hard ask. So that's the part of this sample message that you see. I'll be there. I'll be at this action. I'm telling you that we have a housing sleep out to make sure folks are housed. And Rachel, can you make it? That ask, the section, that's that really hard question to ask, right? Can you make it? Hard question. You can't evade it. You can't really say like, oh, thanks for texting me. Like you really got to answer the question, right? That's the commit right there. And those are the 3 C's, right? So the 3 C's have to do with that message that you send. And the follow-up is once Rachel responds to my text and says, I'm interested, can you tell me more? Can you send me the invite? Making sure that she is at the event and taking that flow from our 3 C's to the very end of the follow-up. So that's a little more info there and a sample text. And certainly many of the communications you've gotten from JUFJ follow a similar model where we set a stage and make a hard ask and provide opportunity for you to get some of the automated follow-up in our emails. That's a really great question. Thanks, Amy, for asking that. Are there any other questions? Do we have like 1 more minute left for questions? Great. So then one other question to uplift, we saw earlier in the chat, a question about speaking to personal stories and using those in one-on-ones. So I do want to uplift that that is something we'll be covering pretty in depth at the one-on-one training on September 13th, and that you will get an opportunity to sign up for that. So I want to ask everyone here, think about it. Can you make it to that one-on-one training? All right, and we'll give a few more minutes for the one-on-one training, or excuse me, for any questions. Great, I got a question in the private chat. So it's a request for us to identify and preventing volunteer burnout, which I really appreciate that question. Yes, it's so important to both respect boundaries, right? And respect our understanding of folks' personal lives when making asks. We will pocket this request. So thank you so much to the person who sent this to us. And so I think I will pass it back to Eliana to guide us through our closing and share more information about next steps.
Thanks, Devorah. So we will talk about the upcoming JUFJ events in just a moment. But first, we would love to invite you to fill out our feedback and commitment form. This is the first time that we've given a training like this, and we really would love and really, truly do value your feedback. So the link to that form is going to be in the chat. I also see that Laura is sharing it, so thank you. And as many of you already know and have heard a little bit tonight, we have some really exciting programming lined up over the next month and a half. And on this form, you can see on this screen, you can let us know if you're able to join us. And so when you fill out this form, we staff will go ahead and sign you up for the events you're interested in. So you don't need to worry about an extra step of registration. So we have a couple events coming up. We have our one-to-one training, which will be on the 13th. We also have on October 17th, our Maryland statewide kickoff, where we're going to be launching our campaigns in Annapolis for the coming year. And the DC folks have done a ton of hard work around the budget, and we'll be celebrating that at the end of September. And additionally, if you've heard lots of things tonight that are piquing your interest and want to talk to an organizer or want to learn more about how your interest might align with the work that JUFJ is doing, you can absolutely meet with an organizer on staff. You can feel free to just put in the chat that you want to meet with an organizer, message a member of staff privately, or shoot us an email. So to close us out, we invite you to write in the chat or unmute and verbally tell us one word to describe how you're feeling or something you're taking away from tonight. And folks will stay on Zoom for another couple minutes if you have any questions. And you can also stay on for another moment while you're filling out that evaluation form. So thank you again so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at many events in the near future.
Amazing. Saying words like excited and energized, more excitement, be dedicated. Yeah, thank you all so much. Hooked. Love that word, Catherine. Well, inspired. Thanks, Stan. Challenged and confident. I think the one-to-one training also will offer a lot more confidence. Yeah, and thanks to Devora for the CCCFU. It's catchy.